Brighton Ghosts by Frank Usher. Brighton has more character, more history, and more architectural beauty than any seaside town in Britain. Among its manifold attractions is the fact that it is renowned for its ghosts, if one can list ghosts as attractions. Although there are no really ancient buildings in Brighton, it nevertheless has some unique features which are not to be found elsewhere. There is, for instance, the lanes, a network of narrow alleyways and twitins situated right in the centre of the town, and which represent the old paths which once separated the various gardens or parcels of land. In the lanes are to be found all manner of quaint little shops selling antiques, bric-a-brac, second-hand books, old silverware and china, Victoriania and Brightoniania. Antiquarians and seekers of the unusual find the lanes a happy hunting ground. The late Queen Mary was frequently to be seen in the narrow, drowsy passageways of this oasis in busy Brighton. Though the district has been largely rebuilt within the last century or so, there are many very old houses, and some of the buildings were built into part of the ancient priory of St Bartholomew, the old walls of which, with their characteristic flint buttresses, can be seen in the cellars of some of these quaint houses. Beneath others are to be found ancient pillars, Gothic arches, and the massive oak timberings of medieval times. Various ghosts are reported to have been seen in the lanes, the most persistent and most famous of which is the grey nun who haunts the alleyways at twilight. This nun is distinguishable from all other nuns by the fact that if you peer underneath the dark cavity of her hood, you will find that there is no face there at all. Such human inquisitiveness causes the nun to glide quickly towards the old friend's meeting house, where she walks through an archway which has been bricked up for more than a century. Her story is linked with the chapel and priory of St Bartholomew, which was built shortly after 1120 and destroyed together with the whole town during a naval attack upon Brighthelmstone by the French fleet in 1514. During the 12th century, the priory, which was only a small one and dependent on the priory of St Pancras Lewes, was guarded by a detachment of soldiers against depredations of the band of robbers who roamed the Sussex countryside. The girl, no one knows her name, was a novice in a religious institution not far away. Beautiful, of course, by tradition, and she fell in love with one of the soldiers who guarded St Bartholomew's. The two eloped and were chased by soldiers. The novice and her lover, who put up a valiant fight, were finally overcome and brought back to face the rough justice of the time. The traditional punishment of being bricked up alive together within the walls of St Bartholomew's. This is a familiar story. There are countless legends of eloping nuns being walled up alive with their lovers, but it must be remembered that countless girls in those days were forced into convents without their having any desire to pursue the way of life prescribed by these institutions, and the savage punishment of being walled up alive for the crime, not so much of unchastity but of getting married, was not uncommon in those days. Though a dreadful death, it was convenient for the ecclesiastical authorities, for it did not actually involve them in the shedding of blood, and as the wretches slowly starved to death, the good abbot and his monks could pray for their souls on the other side of the brickwork. This unfortunate nun has for the last 800 years haunted the scene of her miserable incarceration and death. But why the nun only? Why has not the soldier joined his mistress in the haunting? The reason is that by tradition the nun has committed the far greater sin, and has probably damned her immortal soul for all eternity. The poor thing. Brighton really came into its own when the Prince Regent, later George IV, settled there and built his fantastic pavilion. He was followed by his court and society, for whom the many rows of splendid Regency houses, now the glory of Brighton, were built. Prinny himself is said to haunt the underground passageway which connects the Royal Pavilion with the Dome. No, not many have seen him. Martha Gunn, the famous bathing woman, is said to haunt the pavilion kitchens which she frequented during her lifetime. Queen Victoria quickly abandoned Brighton as a royal residence, as it was far too vulgar and public for her tastes. She sold her uncle's pavilion, ghosts and all, to the town for £50,000, which has turned out to be an excellent investment, for, restored in all its splendour, this unique building is now one of the showplaces of England. Despite Victoria's frown, Brighton greatly prospered during her long reign, for the curious, but probably human reason that it was one of the few places in her realm where Victorianism did not take a firm foothold. Brighton always remained raffish and gay. But many aspects of the grinding Puritanism, which was one of the characteristics of 19th century life, took root in Brighton, as was only to be expected. The harsh poor laws and the unfeeling treatment of unmarried mothers caused untold suffering and unhappiness all over the country. In consequence of this, a particularly interesting haunting resulted in Finsbury Road, which is in early Victorian Brighton, on the slopes of the steep hill which rises on the eastern side of the old Stane Valley. The building concerned had once been a workhouse and then later became a church army home for fallen women. In 1952, this building was taken over by Mr. and Mrs. B.B. Funnell, who own a furniture-making business, Bevan Funnell Limited. Mr. Funnell at the time was a member of Hove Borough Council and became Mayor of Hove in 1960. He was also a special constable, and both he and his wife were practical, matter-of-fact business people. The truth of their story is indisputable, and there is no question of their imagining the strange and ghostly things they experienced in this building. As soon as they took over the place and moved in with their staff and equipment, strange things began to happen. Although the building was locked up carefully every night, as all business premises are, the constable on the beat continually found the doors all unlocked, and Mr. Funnell had to return to lock up again. So frequently did this happen that Mr. Funnell and the police were convinced that intruders were getting into the place, although there was no evidence that this was so, and nothing had been stolen. The matter was investigated by Brighton CID, who went there one night with Mr. Funnell to find the place unlocked. After all the doors had been previously locked most carefully in the presence of several persons when the staff left earlier that evening. Upon entering the building, both Mr. Funnell and the police officers heard footsteps plainly on the upper floor. It was the sound of people running about and talking. The police, confident of arresting these troublesome intruders, at last ran up the stairs. The noises and the footsteps were coming from a large room in the upper story. The police officers flung the door of the room open. Instantly the sounds ceased, as if they had been cut off by a switch. There was no human being in that room, and the whole building was now wrapped in utter silence. Puzzled, the police made a thorough search of the building, but found no one, and could find no cause for the strange and quite unmistakable sounds of people talking and walking, about which both they and Mr. Funnell had heard very plainly. Baffled, the police left. Someone, they said, must be playing some kind of trick. But trick or not, the noises continued and increased and soon began to be heard in the daytime. The staff became a little unnerved by the ghostly footsteps tramping about on the floor above them. They often went up to the floor above to try and locate the sounds or surprise the intruders, but, like the police, whenever they opened the door of this haunted room, they were greeted by an unnerving silence. Once one of the workmen saw a ghostly woman in black standing in the workshop. At first he thought it was a customer and turned to Mr. Funnel to comment to him upon the facts. But when he looked again at the woman, she had vanished. A thorough search failed to find any such woman in the building. The Funnels and their staff were now convinced that they were in a haunted building, and they began to make inquiries about its history, and found out that it had been a workhouse and then a home for fallen women. Unmarried females, unfortunate enough to have children, were treated harshly in Victorian times, and institutions for their rehabilitation and salvation were run practically on penal lines. This Finsbury Road building was a gloomy place, and it had seen much tragedy and unhappiness. You could feel the misery in the very walls, Mrs. Funnel said. In the centre of the building was a small room they used as an office. Across the passage was a cloakroom and lavatory. One day in this passage they were assailed by a strong perfume. This was no ordinary perfume, and it was smelt by everybody. Mrs. Funnel described it as a perfume such as she had never smelt before. It was a heavy, musky smell, almost like incense, but it was by no means an ecclesiastical smell. It was peculiarly feminine and sensuous, a woman's scent, quite unforgettable. Sometimes this extraordinary perfume would seem to blow in waves through the building. They could discover no reason, no origin for it. Nothing that was used in the workshop could produce such a smell. Spectral smells of this kind are not uncommon. They are noted at Borley Rectory in pre-Price days and also at Hinton Ampler. One day a heavy knitted cardigan in black wool appeared mysteriously in the cloakroom. It was hanging on a peg and was deeply impregnated with this strange perfume. No one owned it. It had been left there by no one. A day or two later it vanished as mysteriously as it had come and was never seen again. The pet dog belonging to Mr. and Mrs. Funnel was on one occasion found shut in one of the upstairs rooms by a heavy sliding door, which could not have been accidentally closed by the dog itself. There was no one on the premises who could have closed the door. It is true that little mystery, as well as the problem of the black knitted cardigan impregnated with the mysterious perfume, could have had a natural explanation, and in fact the Funnels suspected for a long time that they were being subjected to tricks played upon them by a person or persons who had some interest in getting them to leave the building. But even supposing this was so, some of the things that happened completely baffled explanation. The eerie business of Mrs. Funnel's typewriter set all their nerves on edge. The typewriter was in the little office across the corridor from the cloakroom. Mrs. Funnel at that time did all the office work connected with the firm's business, and was the only one on the premises who used a typewriter. Upon a number of occasions this typewriter would be heard typing fast and furiously when no one was in the room. When the door was opened, the noise of typing instantly stopped. No one was ever able to explain this mystery. As was to be expected, the Funnels had plenty of trouble with their staff over the haunting. Many were frankly scared off straight away, others laughed at the idea of ghosts being there. but soon changed their minds. Others stuck it out of loyalty to the firm or a reluctance to believe in such supernatural nonsense. In particular, one woman, who at first was plump, jolly, and looked the picture of health. After a while, the atmosphere in the factory at Finsbury Road played upon her nerves and health to such an extent that she was a changed person. She lost weight, became worried and unhappy. It was as though the weird feeling of misery, which was in the very walls of the building, had in some way become transferred to her. In 1953, a year after the Funnels took the building, some local spiritualists held a séance there in an attempt to get in touch with the troubled spirits, often a way by which a haunting can be ended. Mrs. Funnel attended this séance, during which the ghost was apparently contacted by the medium, a man who asked it why it was troubled. The reply came through in a girl's voice, speaking in an uneducated Sussex accent. "Matron is cruel to me. I am desperately unhappy. I tried to be good, but I can't." "She sounded a miserable weeping thing," said Mrs. Funnel. The Funnels were sceptical about this séance. After all, it was well known that the place had been a home for unmarried mothers in Victorian times, and it was easy to imagine that it had been a house of desperate unhappiness and harsh, even pitiless discipline. Nevertheless, a strange thing happened immediately after the séance had finished. As soon as the spiritualists had left, there was a tremendous noise of people running about the building, of doors banging, people calling, of pounding footsteps. And then, suddenly, there was silence. The silence lasted uninterruptedly until the Sunday before the Christmas of 1954, when Mr. Funnel went to the office in the building by himself to catch up with a rush of work. By now the ghosts had been almost forgotten, and the strange, unaccountable events of the past couple of years had completely gone out of his mind, which at that moment was concerned only with the urgency of coping with the rush of Christmas business. He went into the little office where his wife's typewriter had been heard unaccountably typing in her absence. It was a bright, sunny morning, and there were no shadows or reflections in the little room, which was half flooded with December sunshine, as he opened the door. He got the shock of his life. As he entered the room, he heard something drop, and he turned to look at the sloping desk, which ran along the wall to the corner of the room. In this corner, which was perfectly light and without any shadow, he saw a dark grey shape upon the desk. The shape was half hooded and in some strange way incomplete. It was a shape without a great deal of form, though it seemed to have density and substance. It would appear that when Mr. Funnel came into the room, it was in the act of materialisation, and it was materialising on the desk, resting upon it. Mr. Funnel said that this thing seemed to emanate a strange and deadly power, which filled him with an overwhelming fear. The effect upon him was devastating. He fled. When he arrived home, he was ashen, and his wife said that he looked almost like one dead himself. Mr. Funnel was so shaken by his experience that he told the story to the vicar of his church, who arranged an exorcism. What took place at the exorcism was not revealed, but the exorcist, a Sussex man, claimed to have been able to make contact easily with this troubled spirit, and was able to give it such comfort as was necessary to prevent its further activities in Finsbury Place. Whether one can believe this or not, the Funnels were not troubled any more by this particular ghost. They presently left the building, which was pulled down, flats being erected in its place. But strange noises are still reported from the part of the flats approximating the position where the little office and cloakroom were. The feeling of malignancy directed towards him, as opposed to his own natural fear, which was reported by Mr. Funnell, raises interesting questions. He described it specifically as a feeling of hate towards him. Some would say it was an evil spirit from the bottomless pit of hell, and this would explain the sensation he felt. On the other hand, the exorcist apparently did not come into contact with any malignant spirit of this kind. There may have been more than one spirit there, of course. Judging by the uproar sometimes heard in the place, there must have been a whole flock of ghosts disturbing the building. There are some who think that the dead are envious of the living, hating them because they possess flesh and blood they no longer have, and desires and lusts they can no longer satisfy. This is a very old idea and is embodied in the primeval cult of the dead, which held that the young in particular resent death and return to the place of their demise in order to torment and terrify the living. Equally terrifying and somewhat more grisly was the experience some years ago of a Brighton antiquarian. He had heard that there was a hoard of old books in the basement of a junk shop near the junction of Upper Rock Gardens and Edward Street, a part of Brighton which was built in the early years of the 19th century. He found the books stored in what had been the old kitchen and which was now disused, a musty, desolate place which did not boast an electric light. His attention was particularly drawn to an alcove in which was a great stone sink, shaped like an ancient sarcophagus. Above the alcove was an archway of small blood-red bricks set in a curious zigzag pattern. The place had a strange, eerie atmosphere, and had it not been for the very promising collection of old books which were stored there, he would not have cared to stay. It was getting towards evening, and the owner of the junk shop said that he never remained in the place after dark, and gave him the keys, telling him to look through the books at his leisure and lock the place up when he went. Arming himself with a couple of candles, a flask of coffee and some sandwiches, the antiquarian settled down in the gloomy basement and began to browse through the fascinating books he found there, oblivious at first of the silence, which was deep, oppressive, and unearthly. After a while, a feeling of macabre chill began to creep over him. The place had an atmosphere of evil as well as coldness, which made him feel afraid and uneasy. Suddenly the books lost all interest for him, and he could not shake off the feeling that he was not alone in that silent, candle-lit basement kitchen with its great coffin-like sink, and that someone, or indeed something, was there also, watching him. He stood up suddenly and looked towards the archway, and to his terror he saw a naked woman standing beside that dreadful sink. The woman was fat, almost shapeless, and his terror was caused by the fact that she had the face of someone long dead, with eyeless sockets and cheeks falling in with decay. But her limbs, he said, were swollen and blotched. It was an appalling and ghastly sight. The spectre seemed to hover there beside the great sink, the eyeless sockets appearing to be fixed upon him. "Who are you? What do you want?" stammered the terrified antiquarian. If he expected a reply, and ghosts sometimes do reply, now it is said they have to be spoken to first before they can speak themselves, he was disappointed. The ghost just stood there, or rather hovered before his eyes. He had a book in his hand, and he suddenly flung it at the apparition. It went straight through her and hit the archway behind. Then slowly the thing disappeared. Gathering his belongings, the antiquarian left in a hurry, no longer interested in the fascinating old books. He had arranged to leave the keys with a woman who lived in the upper part of the tall old house. "Good gracious me, sir, she exclaimed when he knocked on her door. "Have you been down there in that dungeon? You look as pale as a ghost. Me, I wouldn't go down there for all the money in the world. The old boy had no right to let you, not after dark." The antiquarian asked what it was down there that was so frightening, not revealing what he himself had seen, and the woman told him that the basement had been haunted for the past half-century or so, and that she herself had once met the ghost on the old cellar stairs, and the thing had gone right through her, leaving her in a state of shivers for weeks. Afterwards, and bringing back her rheumatism and arthritis in the most painful fashion. It transpired that about 60 years previously a man had murdered his wife in that kitchen, and had dismembered her body in that great old sink, with the object of burying the remains underneath the stone floor of the kitchen. Fortunately, the law caught up with him before he could complete his odious work. A mayoress of Brighton, as well as a mayoress of Hove, was also involved with a Brighton ghost. This was Mrs. Anne Johnson, wife of Mayor A.J.M. Johnson, who was mayor of Brighton in 1960 to 1961. Shortly after the last war, Mrs. Johnson was living in a flat in Prestonville Road. Every night as she got into bed, she noticed a curious sensation that somebody else was sitting on the end of the bed, although no one else was in the room. After a while, the invisible presence vanished. She got used to her nightly unseen visitor, although she did not stay in that particular flat for long. After she had vacated the place, a retired member of the Brighton police force told her that it was at that flat and in that very room that a man had murdered his wife. Mrs. Johnson is not a psychic type of woman and has never had such experiences either before or since. A curious haunting took place at the turn of the century in Whitchurch House, one of those large detached residences which face Brighton's Preston Park, on the main road coming into the town, and it was told many years later by a woman who had been a housemaid there at the time, now a Mrs. M.E. Holland of Woodingdean, Brighton. Whitchurch House stood in its own grounds and had its own stables and coach-house. Leading off the dining room was a small room called the den, which had French windows opening onto the lawn. Mrs. Holland's duties included cleaning the den, which she did at 6:30 every morning. At this hour, precisely every morning, these French windows slowly opened and slowly shut again. At first Mrs. Holland thought it was the wind, or that it was a trick by one of the other maids. But there was no wind, and there was no other maids about. What was really strange was the fact that when the doors opened, they were securely locked and bolted, and so they were after they had closed again. This happened regularly every morning at 6:30. The puzzled Mrs. Holland regarded the phenomenon with great curiosity. She tried to stop them while they were being opened in this peculiar manner, but was unable to, for they were being moved by an irresistible force. Once she opened the doors herself before 6:30, but they immediately shut themselves and waited until the appointed time. On each occasion when the doors opened themselves in this mysterious way, cold air came into the den, regardless of whether it was cold outside or not. Becoming frightened, Mrs. Holland told the master of the house, who at first laughed at her, but then got up early one morning and witnessed the phenomenon himself. Visibly shaken, he sold up and left the house immediately, leaving the mystery unsolved. This is the kind of ghost story which surely no one could possibly have invented.